lead the event and to introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Richard Holliver, thank you very much. As Richard mentioned, I am Robert Harrell. I'm the Executive Director of the Consumer Federation of California. Good afternoon. For those of you joining from the Eastern Time Zone, good evening. So as Richard said, this is the first of what we hope to be a semi-ongoing series with authors and other prominent advocates that we can have some thoughtful, hopefully, conversations with. A couple housekeeping matters before we get going. Those of you attending, what you'll find in the chat is that Shauna Batista, thank you, Shauna, who's helped organize the logistics of all this. She'll be popping in a couple of pieces of information throughout the hour. One of them will be if you would like to get become a CFC member for a one-year membership, a minimum of $30 contribution, you will get a free copy of Richard Cordray's book, Watchdog, and signed. And then we also have negotiated with Richard's publishing house, Oxford University Press, a discount, about a 30% discount that you can get the book for $20, and then there's some shipping. So in the chat, you will see those options. Just click on the relevant links, put in your information, and you can pay right there. So we've been around for 60 years, the organization that is, Consumer Federation of California. I've obviously not been the executive director for 60 years. I'm coming up on 1 year now. But with that, I'd like to introduce our guest this evening, and someone who I've had the great pleasure of getting to know him a lot better this last year. We've worked together on some important reforms here in California, and that'll be one of the topics that I'll be talking about with him later on this hour. Richard Cordray. Richard Cordray ran the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB, from 2012 to 2017. Prior to that, he'd been the Attorney General of the state of Ohio. Prior to that, State Treasurer. We're going to talk a little bit about some of his background because it's not as prominently mentioned in the book. So with that, let me welcome and say hello to Richard Cordray. Good evening for you, because you're back in Ohio. So thanks, Richard, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure to be with you, Robert, and to join the group.
Thank you. So I thought I'd start sort of broad. So you wrote this book, Watchdog. Here's my dog-eared copy of it. Lots of notes and dog-eared pages on it. And we'll be talking about this obviously much more in the course of the hour. But I wanted to get a little bit of context of who you are, especially for some of our attendees and viewers that may not be, they're certainly familiar with you, I'm sure, in your CFPB context. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? Are you originally from Ohio? And how did you get first interested in politics and public policy? And how did that, sort of getting to local official and moving up the ranks, how did that sort of work in your situation?
Sure. And Robert, there's so many canine puns that could be made with this book. I see you've already gotten into the spirit talking about your dog-eared copy, but it's a dog-eat-dog world out there. Let me just say that my background in consumer finance, first of all, it's striking to me that I ended up being the first director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because that was certainly not a job you could prepare for or aim for, because of course it didn't even exist until the year 2010. But as it was, through my own background and experiences, both in politics and in government, I ended up with a lot of homely credentials, if you will, and a lot of very practical experience that bore on the position, as it turned out, of running that new agency. My very first experience with consumer financial protection, I suppose, I didn't see it at the time, was I was in the Ohio State Legislature a number of years ago, and the Realtors Association came to me with an idea for a bill that they would like to see passed, and I was struck at the time that it was a bill that would regulate their industry more tightly, which I wouldn't have thought they would have wanted to see. But the nature of real estate is that you thrive on repeat customers. And when customers are dissatisfied, you know that that's a problem for future business. And the realtors had found that, more often than they would like, they had residential real estate buyers who ended up dissatisfied with the product, because at the time in Ohio, it was really caveat emptor, the buyer beware. And there was no obligation on somebody selling residential real estate to let the buyer know, prospective buyers know about any material problems that the seller was aware of, but the buyer might not be in a position to be aware of, such as problems with the septic system or mold or whatever it may be. Now, you can always get an inspection, although in today's red hot real estate market, people are often leery of taking the time to get an inspection because it might be sold out from under them by somebody willing to take the risk. But we actually put a bill forward and got it passed in the Ohio General Assembly, and it is now law in Ohio, and it's law in many other states now, that the seller of residential real estate is obliged to reveal any material problem with the property that they are aware of that the buyer might not know, so that the adjustments can be made in the price or repairs or refurbishing before the sale occurs. And that ends up with much more satisfied customers, and the real estate business is able to move forward with fewer regrets, fewer problems, fewer lawsuits. So it was an example to me, oddly enough, of good regulation and even-handed rules that allowed business to operate better, free of the fact that some people would try to cheat others and take advantage of them. And that's a philosophy that I carried through all the way into the job, through my other jobs in state treasurer and state attorney general, and to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And we always thought that our regulation of the financial industry would improve its performance, improve the market, improve consumer confidence, and be good for both sides of the table.
And the book, to a certain extent, especially towards the end, and some of your closing comments kind of speaks to that a little bit. And I've got a couple questions a little later on that we'll drill down a little bit more. But it really is reflective, to a certain extent, of some of the debate that was happening within the Democratic Party in the presidential primaries, for example. This notion of, I think best personified by Elizabeth Warren, that she's a capitalist, but she wants it to work and wants there to be regulation that protects people, versus more of a democratic socialist view, which isn't dramatically different, but there are some important distinctions there, and so that I thought was an important debate, is still, even as the Biden administration is about to take over, and we'll get to that in a few minutes as well. So you work up the ranks, you're state treasurer, you're attorney general. I know that after you finished your tenure with CFPB, you ran for Ohio governor, and it begs the question, given the 8-point win this year and then 8-point win, I believe, 4 years ago, there's a lot of talk about sort of Ohio becoming more red. It's also, I think, melded in with talk about the, the Democratic Party speaking to the white working class and how you do that. And I find it personally, in reading Watchdog and thinking about those issues, it really is profound, because that's the kind of protection that people don't always necessarily think about, but that is really important to making people feel like government works for them, that government it's of them, by them, and ultimately for them. And this conversation about the elites and the moneyed interests and things like that. So I want to pivot a little bit to I'm always interested in hearing authors talk about their writing process. So in your case, I'd like to know, when did the idea of coming up with a book, writing a book, come to you? And what was your writing process like? The Obama first half of his presidential, the 700-page tome of his years, which I have, and maybe we'll read over the next few weeks. I remember reading something and said that he hand writes out the first draft of his book. What was your process like? Were you kind of writing every night for, from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m.? Or can you describe that a little bit for us? And then we'll jump into the book itself.
Sure. And look, I think if you're a figure like Barack Obama, you get a little more latitude from your readers. If he's going to write 700 pages, I think people assume that's going to be worthwhile to read. I think for other authors, it remains to be proved whether they can hold the audience's attention that way. I aimed for a much shorter book, and there was a lot of editing, and much of my prose was slimmed down. I think it makes for a quicker read and a better read with shorter chapters. But I did my writing on the computer, and I've gotten used to doing that over the years, and to editing and being edited on the computer. Often, though, you need to avoid writer's block by changing up in various ways. So there were lots of times where I would print out what I had been writing and then work on it by hand off of a printed version, inserting things with arrows and balloons and so forth. And probably by the end of much of it, I was the only one who could have made out what I thought I was actually saying. But actually, interestingly, Robert, your prelude to that question, I think, is relevant to why I wanted to write the book, because I very much believe that the work we were doing at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was the kind of work that supports the working class and middle class America that we know and care about, and that has had such an important influence on the stability of our political system. And knowing that government can be effective in meeting the needs of middle and working class Americans, that they actually can have a voice that somebody will listen to in Washington, as opposed to it only being thought that the powerful and the influential with the clout and the lobbyists and the money can get their voices heard there. I thought that was an incredibly important principle to establish. And the Consumer Bureau, the CFPB, was in a position to do that. And there was a ferocious debate around that issue all the time. The financial industry and powers that be did not necessarily want people to think that the government could be working effectively for the average citizen, because that would suggest a different point of view than they were pushing for the moneyed interests. And I thought that this book could contribute importantly to the debate over which side is right about that and how to characterize this work. Is it about heavy-handed intervention in the so-called free market that undermines capitalism and business? Or is it about ensuring fairness for Americans who often are outmanned and outgunned, individual on one side of the table, big financial company on the other side of the table, and not able to have their voices heard? I thought that was an important debate to contribute to. And I think it's really important for the health of our nation that the citizenry believe and have realistic expectation that the government can meet their needs and can address their problems and will listen to them and hear them, so they're not simply alienated. That's why I say in the heading of my book, not just about saving our families and our economy, but also our democracy. I think it's important in that way. I think you put your finger on it.
I think especially in these times, right? I mean, one can argue that we're more polarized than ever. Donald Trump got 74 million votes, which is the second most number of votes for president ever. He still lost by 7 million votes, and we don't pick a president by the popular vote. But there's this sort of disbelief that 81 million people voted for Joe Biden, and this sort of denialism, right? That you have to deal with. And I think, without oversimplifying it, I think it does connect a little bit to this notion of the system, whether it's the Bernie Sanders critique, or the Elizabeth Warren critique, or the Donald Trump critique, that it's rigged, right? Never mind that some of the people that Trump has been associating with are some of the riggers, one could argue. So I also, one point on editing, I assume it's a little bit harder to edit a president than it is to edit other authors. So maybe that's how you get to 700 pages for part one of your presidential experience.
No, I actually think Barack Obama has more to talk about than most of us do. And I think people are really interested to hear the why and the background and what he was thinking, because that's not something that you talk much about when you're serving as president. It's something that you can take the luxury of talking more about once you've finished your service. And I think it's going to be fascinating. I have that book on my Christmas list for the coming month.
Yeah, I just had a birthday, so I got it as a birthday present, so that's why I already got it. So that's a perfect segue to, let's get into a bit more detail about the book. A couple of things. In a few minutes, I want to talk to you about different sort of industry sectors and some of the experiences that you write about quite profoundly in the book. But one thing that was interesting to me is that I was a little surprised when I read in the book that until she had reached out to you, Elizabeth Warren, who I think is viewed as the sort of intellectual brainchild of what became the CFPB when she was a professor at Harvard and working on bankruptcy in particular, and had written extensively about that topic and famously sort of butted heads with Joe Biden back in the day a little bit on that issue, that you didn't know her. Can you talk just a little bit about that reach out process and how that came to be? And then an extension of that would be then how your sort of the feeling out with the Obama administration was working, because I know that there was a moment where apparently McConnell made it very clear behind the scenes that he would never in a million years support Elizabeth Warren to actually be the first official head of the CFPB. So she arguably kind of helped stand it up, and then you were involved. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that process for us.
Actually, what they said, not just behind the scenes, but publicly, was that they wouldn't support anybody to be the first director of this bureau because they were going to try to strangle it and shut it down and not let it get its legs under it. And that was a big part of the opposition we faced in the early going. Now, we always had tremendously strong support from President Obama. He had helped fight to get the Consumer Bureau into the Dodd-Frank Act, which was the reform law that came on the heels of the financial crisis of 2008. And of course, it was law professor Elizabeth Warren at the time who was also fighting to get that agency passed into law. And thankfully, Barney Frank in the House of Representatives and Chris Dodd in the Senate were fierce in their defense of this idea. They thought it was needed, and they saw to it that it got pushed through. But there was plenty of opposition nonetheless. And of course, if you remember, in 2010, there was the Tea Party revolt among the populace, and the House of Representatives switched from Democratic control to Republican control. And many of those people were foes, early foes of the Bureau. By the way, it's interesting because behind the scenes, I always thought it was a telling indicator. All of those congressional people who, whether they were for us or against us in public, they had plenty of constituents who had consumer finance problems and issues, foreclosures or issues with their credit cards or student loans. And they would send those issues over to the agency for us to try to work on them and try to resolve them. So behind the scenes, they saw that we were helpful and even necessary to deal with these problems, even though there was a public rhetorical position that might be to the converse. Back to your point about how I came to the Bureau, I did not know Elizabeth Warren when she reached out to me to recruit me to the Bureau. It turned out that she was looking for somebody who could work with other attorneys general in the states around the country because she could see that that partnership would be important to enforce the law. And I was an attorney general who had been very aggressive about taking on Wall Street, and I had just been defeated in my reelection bid in 2010. She reached out to me about 2 days later. She says in her book that she gave me about 24 hours to grieve and then reached out to me and thought maybe that wasn't as sensitive as it might have been, but it turned out to be effective in recruiting me to the Bureau. But my background in Ohio had been that we had been early to the foreclosure crisis in the Midwest. Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana for several years led the nation in foreclosures, and it seemed like a Rust Belt problem because it wasn't being experienced in the rest of the country. Later, of course, it shifted and moved into the Sand States, California and Arizona, Nevada, Florida. But at the time, it was a big problem, and we were working on it in Ohio, and I was organizing crude Save Our Homes task forces, county by county around the state to try to help people stay in their homes and not be foreclosed upon. And that was some of the background that brought me to the attention of President Obama and of Elizabeth Warren. But I did not know her at the time. Her background had been as a top law professor in the country, somebody who was well known for her efforts, consumer efforts in the area of bankruptcy reform, which led to credit card reform. But I was just starting to become aware of her when she had reached out to me, and we ended up working closely together, and I just think the world of her.
So in a way that, you know, the tidal wave of 2010, the Tea Party, I think the Republicans took over 63 seats in the House of Representatives, if I'm not mistaken, you know, massive, seen at the time as, you know, Obama's biggest defeat by far. And he was, I think, quite humbled publicly and privately by all accounts by it. Swept you out as AG. I believe, was it Mike DeWine that beat you in that race?
Correct.
Then?
Yeah.
So, so the governor's race was some sort of a rematch, if you will, of
It was, yes.
Okay.
Yes,
so,
and I lost that race, as you noted. The presidential race in Ohio, each of the last two times, has been an 8-point race. I lost by 3.5 points, but it's cold comfort because there's no real prize for finishing second in a political election in the United States of America.
Yeah, just ask Senator Beto O'Rourke about that. Getting 3 points of Ted Cruz is not the same as being a U.S. senator. So, but fair enough. But in a way, it was it's the, you know, life is strange, right? It became the benefit of consumers through the CFPB. I want to talk a little bit
It was a
about,
very fortunate occurrence, as it turned
yeah,
out, yes.
I think for consumers as well, because I think we're far the better protected because of your work. So I appreciate that very much. You talk in the book about Dodd-Frank, and then before I transition into kind of management and culture and some specific issue areas, I just want to evoke, and I hope it's okay, I do like to hear authors occasionally read a little bit from their book if you have your one of many copies handy. You talk about cooperative federalism. And cooperative federalism is, I think, an important concept that's relevant, particularly in this area, and especially here in California, as we have now the Department of Business Oversight, which is now morphed into DFPI, the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation. And this relates to Dodd-Frank and what's known as UDAP, which I'm going to ask you about in a couple minutes. So I wonder if there's a provision here on page 80 where you talk about cooperative federalism. If you would be so kind as to, you can kind of pick whatever provision there you find the most relevant. You can either pick there, or there's another one on page 86 where you talk about the sort of badge of honor and enforcement that I want to get to in a few minutes.
Okay, sure. And this is a theme that I've been sounding consistently over the years for a number of reasons. As you noted, I started out in state government, and I was both a state treasurer and a state attorney general. And I saw both the possibilities and the limitations of that role. The limitations of the role of state attorney general is that sometimes you are preempted by federal law from taking on problems and addressing them satisfactorily. The opportunity is that you do have broad powers, and if you're creative, you can find ways to address these problems. And creating Save Our Homes task forces was just as I say, a kind of makeshift way of trying to deal with a problem and deal with mortgage servicers who often were beyond our reach as a legal matter. But I also felt that when I went to the Consumer Bureau, and this was Elizabeth's view as well, that we could forge a strong partnership both with state attorneys general around the country and with state financial regulators. There's one of those in every state. Manny Alvarez is the one that you and I have worked with in California, and that they're overhauling that department to become a Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, and a stunning victory for consumers in the California legislature this year, which you and I both worked on and worked closely with many other consumer advocates in California. But the point of that is this. First, nobody in California, for example, or any other state, should have to rely on Washington, D.C. to protect consumers. They have all the tools and the authority themselves, if they're willing to put them in place and to use them, to protect their own and not be dependent on Washington to take on the problem. If Washington is inclined to be helpful, then they can work together. And similarly, if the viewpoint is from Washington out to the rest of the country, there's an awful lot that can be done together that a single agency doesn't have the manpower or the resources to do all by itself. And so we had a number of enforcement actions, key enforcement actions, including the big enforcement action against Wells Fargo that's gotten so much attention, but many other enforcement actions where we worked with anywhere from 1 to 50 state attorneys general, 51, counting the District of Columbia, and we were more effective as a result. And that was something we learned, and it was a lesson that continues to apply today. And then, by the way, if Washington retreats and doesn't work effectively in this area, which has been true, I think, under the leadership of the CFPB under Donald Trump, then the states can step in and continue their efforts and reinforce the fact that Californians don't have to wring their hands over what Washington's doing, but they can step up and protect their citizens themselves. I think that's the way federalism is supposed to work, and it does make for a potentially cooperative framework.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly important in the context of Dodd-Frank. Because, as you point out, when you talk about the number of complaints and how you ramp that up, and, it's sort of a massive undertaking, right? You're sort of standing up this new thing, Warren and you, and then you take it over, you run it for almost 6 years. And it's a massive undertaking, as you point out in the book, which again is a brisk read, I think, for people who are interested in these kinds of consumer issues, like obviously we are. It's a good read. You talk about how so many other entities at the federal level really don't take complaints and work those complaints, other than to sort of, you get this sort of, thank you for reaching out to us kind of a response, which, is kind of a non-response response, right? I mean, we've all seen those, and we, I think, get frustrated as consumers when you feel like, oh, they're not really taking my complaint seriously. It's an important concept when it comes to UDAP, for example, and keeping people from getting ripped off. I want to turn a little bit, management is so important, right? And this, I think, is applicable to California. We've sort of worked as a coalition to ramp up the authority of the now DFPI. The culture there, the management there, these are really critical things when you have either a stand-up thing like CFPB that you're familiar with, or when you are, adding authority or clarifying authority in that way, adding new areas of authority. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that in the context of, something that in my years with the California Department of Insurance and the insurance commissioner here, which is a statewide elected office in California, the concept that we were always very cognizant of and worried about, which is captive regulation. This notion that there's a coziness, even if it's not intentional, between the regulator and the regulated entity. There's a sort of comfort level, especially with those where you have examiners going out and looking at the books of companies and things like that, that it breeds a certain familiarity that isn't necessarily sometimes in the long term best interests of consumers. At the same time, you talk in the book about how you brought in a number of experts who had worked in the financial services industry. And to me, there was a very powerful corollary of that. Sometimes they have that expertise, they bring it in, it's almost as if they know all the tricks, right? Because they saw it from the other side. And I don't mean that in an overly pejorative way, but they know how the industry ticks, they know how it works, and who better to then sort of, say to the industry, hey, hang on, that's not gonna fly here, right? I certainly had experience with that at the Department of Insurance. We brought in a really fine guy named John Finston, who had worked in the insurance industry. He became the general counsel under Insurance Commissioner Dave Jones, and he's a really great guy. But then it begs the question of the revolving door, right? Came from industry, comes in, does a great job, and then now is back in industry. And he's a worthy adversary when we're on the other side of an issue, a smart and thoughtful guy. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that management as you're trying to, especially when you have a new organization or one that you're trying to expand the scope of a little bit.
Sure. And the problem of the captive regulator or the revolving door is a perpetual concern, in part because, as you say, if you're regulating powerful industries, they have loud voices and they have a lot of clout and influence, and they're aggressive about exercising it. And if that's what you hear, there's a way in which that starts to feed its way into your consciousness through repetition. That was one of the reasons why, Robert, we were so insistent on creating this consumer complaint database and making it public, so that that loud voice of the industry could be offset in part by us being able to at least hear the voice of consumers from all over the country and see what challenges they were confronting at any given moment. And by the way, to tip back toward federalism for a moment, we opened up that database and made it public so that states and other officials could access it as well and see everything we were seeing and have access to all of it. No reason to reinvent the wheel on that, and that they could learn what was going on in their states just as we were learning what was going on across the country. So all of that is important, but sometimes you do get people from industry who very much are aligned with the mission of the regulating agency. They have seen things that they don't agree with, that they didn't like, and they now want to do something about it. And as you say, they have the understanding and the practical experience to know just how the businesses operate, to know where the tricks and traps are, if you will, and to be able to address them affirmatively. But much of it depends on the culture of the regulator. We were new, and so we had that advantage. People came to the Bureau because they wanted to do something about the misery they'd seen flowing from the financial crisis of 2008. They really wanted to clean up what they saw as lots and lots of problems. And that was an overriding sense of mission that everybody at the Bureau shared. Now, how you sustain that over time is a challenge. But again, one way to try to do that is to make sure that every day we were hearing from consumers across the country. And as I say in the book, one of the things we did was we would put up some of the consumer stories on the walls of the Consumer Bureau so that everybody there was reinforced in the notion, this is what we're all about. This is what we're paying attention to. And when industry officials came in to meet with us, they got that subliminal message, whether we said a word about it or not. They saw that that was our focus from walking down those hallways and seeing what consumers had to say.
Yeah, it's important, especially when you're talking about good sized organization. How many, you were ramping up obviously, but roughly how many people did you wind up with, at least when you left at CFPB?
Well, ultimately, we had about 1,500, which wasn't quite as many as I had as Ohio Attorney General. I had about 1,800 there, but it's a significant workforce and spread some of them all over the country. And so maintaining the morale of the workforce, maintaining a consistent, unified sense of mission is something you have to really work at. And it's something that we all worked at and we try to stress through our leadership, but also through our accomplishments. I always felt that the more the Consumer Bureau did, the more effective it could show itself to be, the stronger it would be, because we were building, laying down roots and reaffirming our constituency among the public. And by the way, groups like yours all over the country supporting that work made a tremendous difference. You brought us ideas, you brought us your passion, you pushed us sometimes farther than we were willing to go, but that's your job, and I understood it. And it helped keep our eye on the ball. And I'm grateful to the consumer coalitions from around the country who were so important in making the CFPB operate as it should.
Right.
And can be again, by the way, under a Biden administration, and I think will be again.
I hold that thought. I do have a couple questions related to that, as well as one of our board members is in a few minutes going to ask a question that relates to that as well. I just wanted to touch base on a couple of particular issues and industry sectors and get your thoughts and feedback that you write about in the, very smartly in the book. One is disclosure. There's an interesting debate that I think is still going on and probably will always be happening about disclosure. And I will tell you that, you know, in my experience, kind of toiling in the consumer fields for the better part of my career, I've come to be a little more wary of certain types of disclosure than I used to be, in part because, and the example you give in the book is the most egregious example. It's, you know, you're buying a home and you get the huge stack. Nobody, I think you mentioned in the book that maybe 2 people have ever, actually, that you knew had actually read the whole stack, and they probably weren't exactly invited to a lot of holiday parties back when people were actually having in-person holiday parties for that action. You know, disclosure sometimes is used, particularly by industry, as a sort of a bit of a facade. Sometimes, to me, it feels like it can be kind of faux consumer protection as opposed to a real more meaningful consumer protection. Having said that, you famously write in the book about Elizabeth Warren and this almost sort of missionary zeal about, can you get it down to 1 page? Can you get it down to 1 page? And on my privacy work and other things like that, I've certainly spent more time with readability experts on making language understandable at the sort of 8th grade level of a newspaper, for example, and getting it shorter. And then what do you lose, right? That trade-off. I wonder if you could talk to for just a minute about disclosure before we jump into specific industry sectors.
Sure. So what is a financial product anyway? And it's a very unusual product compared to, say, a physical product like a car or a house. It is basically a contractual set of terms with some amount of money behind it. That's all it is. So the contractual set of terms really is the product. And therefore, how it's presented to the customer, to the consumer, becomes incredibly important. One of the things that I think the financial industry learned over time, some of it they learned from their own lawyers, is that to protect yourself, you put more into the contract, you put more detail, you put more disclaimers, you put more exceptions, you just more and more detail. And there's never any harm in adding more from the company's standpoint. Also, over time, we passed a point of no return where it got to the point where there was so much in the contract that it became difficult, even prohibitive, for the consumer to read and understand it. And then it came some of the tricks, as you say, like boosting the average reading level of the contract so that it was really unintelligible to the average consumer, and they knew that, and that was deliberate. And ultimately, you got to a point where a financial product might not really be understandable by the consumer. And when that's the case, the industry really has the upper hand. Also, over the years, if you're talking about regulating an industry, there's various ways you can go about it. You can take steps that change their behavior, that is, constrain what they do or don't do, like enforcement actions or regulations, or disclosure is an alternative. And the industry always favored disclosure because it's a softer alternative. Just change the way you say something. That's all you have to do, but the product can remain the same and the revenue it generates can remain the same. One of the things that Elizabeth Warren had an insight on and that the Bureau was very dedicated to was trying to simplify disclosures, make them clearer, more specific, and focus them on the really key points. And if you had a neutral expert body like the Consumer Bureau pointing out that these are the key points, maybe they could focus the consumer and they wouldn't get distracted by all this fine print that otherwise confuses them at no end. That was something that we worked on, and I have a chapter on that I call Know Before You Owe, which was the theme of the Bureau, and that we worked hard on that. But I always felt that couldn't be done at the expense of also doing the harder things, enforcement actions, regulations, substantive change to address substantive problems in the marketplace that affect consumers greatly.
On that, there's an example in the book that is quite profound. As someone who has still deep scars from payday lending battles gone back a number of years, there's a profound comment about the industry, and you've got access to a number of internal documents of some of the payday lenders. And one of them, I believe, if I remember correctly, Richard, it says in all caps, never tell the consumer or the customer what the fee is. Because of course, in the payday lending industry, it's all about rolling over, and that's where the real money is made on those loans, and what makes them sort of really addictive and for many consumers quite damaging. So I wonder if you, I do want.
By the way, Robert, that's a notable point you just made, because often the problems are exposed by looking to see how a financial company talks to different audiences. Mm-hmm. They may say one type of thing to the consumer and phrase things one way. They may say things very differently to their own employees as they're training them. They may say things even differently to their investors, and in trying to show how they're going to make so much money off of consumers. They wouldn't necessarily want to say that directly to consumers themselves. But if you can match up the way they talk to different audiences, often that can expose some real problems in the way they operate.
Yeah, agree completely. Thank you for making that point. Just a couple little housekeeping items, just a little update. We're talking with Richard Cordray, author of Watchdog. My copy here. If you want to become a CFC member, for $30 or more, you get a free signed copy of the book. Otherwise, we've negotiated a 30% discount on the book, so you can get it for $20 and then $5 shipping. So for $25, you can, which is below the list price. Richard's book, Watchdog, it's a good read. Also, one other thing, in a few minutes, we're going to switch over to some questions from the audience. So feel free, there's a Q&A a button down at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to use that information to put questions in, and we'll take a look towards the end of the hour and ask as many as we can. So thank you in advance for that. The information about how to get Richard's book or how to become a CFC member is in the chat function. So thank you very much. On that, Richard, what I'd like to do is I want to bring in one of the CFC board members because you mentioned a few minutes ago, we're entering into now the Biden administration, the president-elect, who was finally acknowledged by Mitch McConnell yesterday as the president-elect, and we all know the difficult tight wire, high wire rope that he's sort of walking there, right? And it'll be fascinating to see what happens in Georgia, because I think many Republicans have put themselves in this sort of crazy box where if you're not denying math, then you're not doing enough. And yet if you're acknowledging math, then you're complicit. It's kind of an amazing thing. We'll see what happens there. But I'd like to bring in Mark Toney. He's the executive director of Turn and one of our board members. Good afternoon, Mark. I should just note that for those who are viewing, Mark has just been named recently by Governor Newsom to the sort of board of the state bar. And I'm sure that there's lots of work to do there, Mark, and I'm sure you'll do a wonderful and fantastic job. Turn is going to remain on our board, but he's going to be personally handing over the reins to another very capable leader of Turn. And Mark is a longtime consumer advocate, and not just in the utility space, but in many others. So, Mark, I know you had a question for Richard Cordray. So, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Robert, for inviting me to do this. Richard, I want to say that this is a real, it's great to have you here. A few years ago, you attended a gathering of consumer organizations that was hosted by the Green Lining Institute in downtown Oakland, and I had the great pleasure of presenting you with a plaque on behalf of the group of California consumer organizations, thanking you for your leadership of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So I just want to say what a pleasure it is to have you with us here today.
Well, thank you. And that went right to my heart, that plaque, because it was a recognition of what the Consumer Bureau was doing, not so much what I was doing. But also I know that Green Lining is a organization that battles ferociously for individuals and consumers and looking out for those who need some looking out for, as we all do from time to time. And that meant a lot to us. That was a real badge of honor for us. Thank you.
Terrific. Here's my question. After you left the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, let's say there were some changes made by the new administration, a real constraining of many of its powers, authority, areas of jurisdiction, if you will. And so my question is kind of an open-ended question. What are the first 2 or 3 changes you would like President Biden to make to restore the power and ability of the Bureau to protect consumers?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. And first of all, let me say, in the book, I talk about the fact that I stayed under President Trump for almost a year. My term was coming to an end, but I was dead set on making sure that we finished the payday lending reform rule and got that in place. And we took on some other fights, and I talk about that in the book. But personnel as policy is often said in Washington, and who's leading these organizations matters greatly. We saw again and again under the Trump administration that people were put in charge of organizations that didn't believe in their mission, whether it was the EPA or the HHS or the CFPB. And it can be very devastating to the goals and unwind a lot of things. However, what is done in that direction can be done in the other direction, and we can move forward again. And one of the reasons I think my book is now very timely is it's not just a story of what happened under the Obama administration, but it's a story of what can happen again. We have all the tools and authorities in place under the Biden administration to restore strong protections for consumers, and I believe that will happen. What are the first things to do? Well, one of the first things to do is to replace the director of the CFPB, which can be done because of a Supreme Court decision that came down in June and said that the director can change with each new administration at the president's will. And I'm quite sure that President-elect Joe Biden will be making that change. And that will do a lot because, as I said, there's no authorities that have been lost to the Bureau. They just haven't been used. They've gotten a little dusty and rusty over the last several years, and they can be turned back to good ends. And I think that will happen. The other major point is we're going to need to review some of the things that were done over the last 3 years, and some of them we'll want to reverse, and some of them we'll want to revise. But there are a lot of old problems that continue to fester, whether it's in the mortgage market or the credit card market or student loans. And there will be a lot of work to do on that. But there's a brand new problem that we hadn't seen before, which is the effects of this COVID crisis on the economy. And many people who were starting to run out of the stimulus help that was given them, was provided to them in the spring. And by the way, provided to them, the interesting thing about the COVID crisis is nobody can blame anybody for the fact that there was an economic downturn. In 2008, with the mortgage market meltdown, there at least was some people who were willing to blame mortgage holders for having taken out bad mortgages. I think there was a lot more predatory behavior, if you ask me, but there certainly was a narrative about, well, people deserve what they get. Here we have an economic crisis that was caused because people were they were ordered to stay home. It wasn't that people got lazy and decided, I'm going to stop working. They were ordered to stay home. The businesses were closed temporarily, and it was understood that there needed to be relief that went to the American people to recognize this peculiar circumstance, and we had that under the CARES Act in the spring. Now we've gone through the bulk of the year, and much of that relief has started to run out for people. We may now be seeing today more relief on its way from Congress, and that'll be temporarily helpful for the next 3 or 4 months, and fingers crossed that that will happen, and I believe it will. But many people are in difficult straits. They're behind on their mortgages if they own a home. They're behind on their rent if they rent housing. And they're in danger of being foreclosed on or evicted and ousted from their housing, which would be devastating in the middle of a pandemic, but will be devastating even after the pandemic ends. And there's much that the Consumer Bureau can be doing to help protect people against harassing debt collectors, against problems with their credit reports, against losing their housing and having some of these things come home to roost in a big lump sum, which is not going to be tenable for most consumers. So I think there's some special challenges that the Consumer Bureau needs to really focus on over the next 6 to 12 months that are going to be really important to helping our country bounce back the way we all want to see it do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Greatly appreciate it. Shauna, if you'd be so kind as to put my video back on, that would be great. Thank you. So we have about maybe 15 minutes left, Richard, and appreciated the question by Mark Tony. I think it's very timely. One of my questions was going to be whether, given the Supreme Court case, you feel like was Kraninger in there for the 5 years from December of 18 until December 23, or can be replaced, and you sort of answered that, so thank you.
I think the Supreme Court case changed everything because it does mean, and there's no doubt, there's absolutely no doubt that President-elect Joe Biden will want to replace the director on day one, and I'm sure that that will happen.
Yeah, appreciate that. And you're right about the case. We didn't go into too much detail in it in this conversation, but it's you summarize it nicely in the book, and the sort of twists and turns and how it wound up, and you being lumped in with a couple of other kind of labor appointees, but your situation was different because then you did get a proper vote and an appointment and things like that. So in the time that we have left, and I do promise one other reminder, go into the chat and you can see the links for getting the book or becoming a CFC member. Feel free to add questions to Q&A. We're going to get to those at the end. So thank you for those who've already contributed questions in the Q&A. Appreciate that. I want to talk briefly about, in California, we have DFPI now. It's really a corollary to Mark's question, right? There's certain things that should be happening at the federal level, kind of reawakening the CFPB, one would hope. What about California? Obviously, debt collectors are now going to be sort of brought into the fold in a more meaningful way. They're going to be registered. That's an industry that historically, it's sort of, as you point out in the book, kind of, it's almost like, if you have a pulse, you can be a debt collector. With the standards, the barriers to entry were so low as to be almost non-existent in that industry. What do you think? As I know that DFPI Commissioner Alvarez had worked for a while under you at CFPB. What do you think are some of the 2 or 3 most important things that California's new Department of Financial Protection and Innovation can do as it begins to kind of get its footing with some of this new expanded authority and ability?
Well, first of all, I think that it's a really exciting prospect that lies ahead for the new DFPI because it fundamentally changes a couple of things. Number one, that department has always viewed itself as a business regulatory department, which, as you note with many regulators, means there's a focus on the businesses, not necessarily on their customers. That really wasn't the focus that was intended for the old DBO. But the DFPI now puts very much front and center that the consumers and protecting consumers is a key part of what the department is supposed to do. So it's a complete mental shift in terms of what the mission is. The other point that's really important is old style business regulation was very much with kind of strings attached. That is to say that the DBO could do certain things once the legislature had specified that they could do them. But if something new arose, they couldn't necessarily address it without going back to the legislature and getting the law changed. And that can be a very cumbersome way of proceeding, as you know. Now, going forward, the DFPI has a baseline that gives it authority to oversee all financial services in California that affect consumers. And rather than the question being, can we do something, it will simply be a matter of how do we do something. And that's a very big change for all of the people there. It's just a brand new opportunity and much more capacity and much more leeway to really carry out their mission. So that's important. One of the things that's obvious that you mentioned is that there's now going to be licensing of debt collectors and there's going to be closer scrutiny of them. That's really important. As we found at the Consumer Bureau, virtually every financial industry has its own innate problems innate to the mortgage industry, problems innate to the credit card industry, but they all have in common that they also have debt collection issues because every financial service involves some customers who haven't paid their bills for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's their fault, sometimes it's not, and they have to go about how to collect debts if the business is going to continue to operate. And there are right ways and wrong ways of doing that. I myself, in government, have been a debt collector at times. I was somebody who enforced property taxes at the local level, and I was somebody who collected debts on behalf of the state at the state level. And I know there's a right way and a wrong way to do this, and there are lines that you're not supposed to cross. And we were very diligent about making sure that we tried to do things the right way. And the same is true for this industry. And it's a sprawling industry. As you say, it can range from just mom and pops who throw out a shingle and get a client list and start working it, to very sophisticated national companies that are highly computerized now and use these algorithms to reach consumers. And about 1 out of every 3 households in America is touched by debt collectors every year. So it's a big deal. It's a big challenge for the agency. And I think it's going to be a big change, positive change for California consumers. There's other things as well. There's a brand new student loan servicer licensing bill and regulatory authority that's going to come into this new department. That's important to many, many young people and their families who owe on student loans and get into lots of problems that we could go on and on about. But there's a number of brand new authorities there, as well as a new baseline of authority for the department. And it's just an exciting time as they get a chance to sit and figure out what they're going to do with all of this. But it's definitely going to be helpful for California consumers.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. We didn't talk about it in detail in this conversation. You do talk about it in the book, but the student loan issue, the student loan servicers as well, student debt, also, you know, the for-profit colleges and the really problematic issues around that. I did see that today there was some developments on the Hill in that, particularly from the angle of the military. I know in payday, the military was sort of, if you will, the bulwark. It was the entry point because you know, you had to go to the 36% rate because you weren't going to rip off people who were willing to die for this country. And then you can have a conversation about, well, why shouldn't that be the case for everybody, right? I mean, these are profound changes. I want to hit a couple of quicker, maybe, I don't want to say lighter topics, but maybe quicker, faster topics before we get to the questions at the end, Richard, if that's okay. We didn't talk much about Wells Fargo, but to the extent that we've talked about culture, I can just share with you, you know, Wells Fargo, it seems to me, which was very problematic. And if you get the book, you know, folks, it's really an interesting conversation. It appears at 2 different places in the book about Wells Fargo. I say this as someone who's been a Wells Fargo customer for many, many, many years. Not that I picked Wells Fargo, but that Wells Fargo kind of picked me. They bought a bank that, you know, Wells Fargo got the Pac-Man, right? I remember as a younger staffer working for, now she's a Congresswoman Jackie Spear on consumer financial privacy. And we knew we were hitting pay dirt when the industry started flying out people from back east to tell us how woefully wrong-headed we were. And then we got summoned, then State Senator Spear got summoned into the office of Dick Kovacevic, who was the head of Wells Fargo for a number of years. And I never had, I mean, that meeting is seared in my mind because there was a level of arrogance and patronizingness that was kind of amazing. There was a level of sexism there too, in terms of how he interacted with Jackie Spear, who is not to be taken lightly, I assure you, and I'm sure you know that as well from your experiences. Um, and and so to me, when the scandals happen, it feels to me like that's not just an island. Yeah, you can talk about the rationalizations of motivations, but there's a culture that happens. This happens in governmental entities. It also happens in companies. And there was a culture there that just felt really, really wrong-headed. I wonder if you could just take a quick moment and talk about that. And then I want to touch base quickly on a couple other things before we get to questions.
Yeah, sure. Look, I would be the first to say that it's not an easy thing to run a big bank with more than $1 trillion in assets and potentially millions of customers and accounts and so forth, and hundreds of thousands of employees. But that's what you sign up for. And if you're doing that, you have to monitor. You have to find ways to monitor your employees and know what they're doing, and you can't be indifferent to that. You can't set unrealistic goals. As Wells Fargo did, saying that essentially 8 is great was their slogan, that every single employee at Wells Fargo was supposed to find ways to take every single customer and have them buy 8 different Wells Fargo financial products. That's an unrealistic goal. And when you put pressure on people to meet unrealistic goals, they will find creative, that is to say, illegitimate and invalid ways to meet those goals. And if you're not monitoring that carefully, then you've set up a system that's bound to fail, and fail in a spectacular way, as it did at Wells Fargo. One of the things we did coming out of that enforcement action, which got so much attention across the country, and by the way, kudos to Mike Feuer, the Los Angeles city attorney, who brought us in and we worked together on that issue, which started in Southern California, and the LA Times great investigative reporting of it. One of the things we did when it was over was we put out a bulletin for all, not just banks, and it wasn't just about credit card accounts and bank accounts being opened without permission. It was about sales goals and setting realistic sales goals and putting monitoring in place to make sure that customers wouldn't be hurt as employees sought to meet the demands put upon them and the pressures of the workplace. And that's something that's general. We didn't want the Wells Fargo situation to be seen only as a bank issue, only as an unfair account opening issue. It's an issue, as you say, about culture, and how you handle that culture goes a long way to whether you're going to be successful at running an institution like that and serving your customers well over time.
Yeah. There's a great quote. It's one of my favorite notes. I would tell you that sometimes I don't read the notes as I'm reading the book, but in this book, I really found it very helpful to every time there was a note, what old guys like me used to call footnotes, right? And now they're at the back of the book. There's a lovely quote here from the case Weiss versus United States from 1941, where it talks about fraud. And I think this is directly linked to the culture, or the quote from the decision, which, as you know, was the United States Department of Justice would put this in their manual so people were aware of it. The law does not define fraud. It needs no definition. It is as old as falsehood and as versatile as human ingenuity. And that just speaks to when you have the wrong culture, you're enhancing and you're encouraging this sort of perverse ingenuity, right? And so anyway, that's a great note and a great quote from the book in that case. I want to wrap up with a couple of quick hits. I can't let the hour go by. I'm not going to ask you about the unitary executive theory and Brett Kavanaugh, who's now on the Supreme Court, and his role in the decision, and also William Barr, about to leave the Department of Justice, and his view of the unitary executive theory. But I would encourage people to read the book because it really is interesting about that. But I want to ask you about Trump very briefly. So you lasted almost a year, basically, under the Trump administration. You talk about the sword of Damocles. You were kind of constantly worried about, am I fired today? I mean, and that's you're halfway joking when you say that, but I'm sure at the time you were really just ready, kind of had your bags packed, like, yeah, he's gonna get rid of me anytime. You speculate.
No, I actually had my lawsuit prepared to defend my position, is what I was planning to do if that had happened.
you talk about the machinations you had to go through about how you could get representation, which is a very interesting story in the book. And you mentioned in passing, and then this will be a segue into the Q&A, because one of the Q&A questions is kind of about Steve Mnuchin, oddly enough, and we'll get to it in a second. Your interactions with, Gary Cohn, who it seems to me kind of, you have a dinner, he's sort of trying to come off as like, it's a little bit of good cop, bad cop. Like, I want to work with you, but let me tell you, there's a bunch of people right behind me. They want your head on a platter. That's the feeling I get from how you characterize it in the book. Also, Mnuchin, you have an interaction with Mnuchin where you sort of reach some sort of détente about how to handle an issue, kind of, right? And then there's what I could refer to as the call, where you're convinced that you were getting a call from the president to fire you, and John Kelly intervenes. If you could just touch really quickly on those, and then we'll get to the questions from the audience.
Yeah, sure. This is after we had done battle with the Trump administration about the arbitration clause rule that we had put in place, and it was ultimately overturned in the Senate on a 51-50 vote, with Mike Pence casting the deciding tie-breaking vote. And afterwards, the people were meeting to discuss what had happened, and President Trump was sort of surveying the room, as I understand it, as to whether I should just be fired, and that would be the easiest way to get rid of this nuisance. And some people were saying that he should, and some people were saying that he shouldn't. And he actually had his secretary get me on the line. I was in Tampa at the time at a field hearing for the Consumer Bureau on mortgage issues, and she calls me out of the blue and says, "Can you hold for the president?" And I held for about a couple of minutes. And then ultimately she came back on the line and said, "Well, we'll have to do it another time. Something's come up." And what I learned was that John Kelly had intervened and said, "We need to take this offline and deal with it separately." He probably did that a number of times on different issues, but that was how this was handled. And I never did hear from the president, and I was never fired.
It's kind of amazing. And then there's this period where you write about it, and you weren't there anymore, but Mick Mulvaney kind of comes over. He's head of OMB at the same time. He's been famously negative when he was in the House before he, became part of the Trump administration. There's this, it's almost like this sort of dueling offices within CFPB, like who's in charge, he's there. And then I know that your chief of staff, you would try to sort of, create a line of succession. And it's just, like so many things in the sort of Trump era, it's almost too weird to believe. I saw something where some of the writers for the show Veep, which is hilarious and utterly brutal about politicians and how they act and stuff. They talk about, some of this stuff, like we couldn't put that in a script because no one would believe it. Things that actually happened. It's kind of amazing to me. I want to wrap up by transitioning over to some of the questions from the audience. Before I do that, and I apologize, we've gone a couple minutes over, but I think it's been a really great conversation. I appreciate you sticking around, and our audience as well. Many of you have stuck around too. Again, in the chat, there's a link to become a CFC member for $30. You get a free copy of the book, Watchdog, with it. You can also get a discounted copy of the book, about a 30% discount. There's links in there. I want to thank Shauna Batista and everybody at CFC who helped kind of put this together logistically. This is the first time for us, so apologize for any difficulties, but we're going to be doing this every so often. And thank Richard Cordray very much for your time and really your friendship as I've gotten to know you over the past year. I hope it's okay that I consider you a friend and an ally. So it's been great, and the work you've helped with the coalition here in California has been quite profound. So I'm looking forward to that. So let's get to the questions. There's one question, and I'll read part of it. It basically says the one person who benefited more than any other person in the country from the FDIC bailouts was Steve Mnuchin. This is referring to his previous role at a California bank that was sort of notorious within banking circles. He had loan guarantees where it cost him nothing. He threw thousands of homeowners out of loan guaranteed homes. And in fairness, the criticism in this question is also that Kamala Harris didn't do enough to help in this situation. Elizabeth Warren didn't do enough to help. What kind of watchdog is that? I think that's more of a comment than a question, but I think it does raise some of the issues, Richard, that we've been talking about for this hour. on, where's that line? Businesses love certainty, right? And, having worked as a regulator for a few years myself and also in the legislature as a staffer, and you, given your experience, I don't disagree conceptually with this notion of this kind of certainty. What are the rules? I could try to follow the rules. Most want to follow the rules, one would hope and think. Do you want to speak to that at all in terms of how you deal with that? And then we'll get to the other couple questions.
Well, as I think back and what I know, and I came in to the CFPB later than the IndyMac situation, but it was during the financial crisis. There was an awful lot that was upended at that time. IndyMac was going into receivership, and there were potential big losses to the FDIC Deposit Insurance Fund. And Sheila Bair, who was heading the FDIC at the time, was trying to find a way to see if we could learn how to do more loan workouts for people who were in danger of foreclosure. And she struck a deal, as I understand it, with IndyMac that they would agree to try to do a certain large number of loan mitigation, loan workouts. And I think not all of that was successful, as you know. But they were groping for footholds at a time when they were in a lot of quicksand with Washington Mutual going down and Countrywide going down and IndyMac going down and AIG and their troubles. So, it's easier to Monday morning quarterback these things. It's tough at the time. And, I don't really have personal insight that I can lend to that situation.
Right, fair enough. And for the person who asked that question and then followed up with a couple of other things, I will be reaching out. So thank you for your thoughts and your comments and questions. There's a question about the name of the new agency, and I think this person is referring to DFPI, right? So here's the short version of that story. It's called the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, DFPI. It most recently had been DBO, the Department of Business Oversight, but it wasn't that for a bunch of years because that itself was an amalgamation of a government reorganization of the Department of Corporations and some other entities, the sort of state banking regulator, if you will. And so that's when Richard, when you make the point about the sort of culture and history, it had not been necessarily as consumer facing as I think it is now. And that is a bit of a culture shift. And I know that I and others within the sort of consumer coalition have really been, I think, working in earnestly in good faith with the department to try to understand that and be helpful if we can with this sort of more consumer facing entity. But to answer that question directly, it is DFPI, Department of Financial Protection and Innovation. It's run by Manny Alvarez, who's the commissioner. Sorry, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, and I was just going to say these words apparently matter. They matter a lot to people. When Mick Mulvaney took over and was the interim head of the Consumer Bureau in Washington, he actually tried to change the name of the bureau by putting the initials in a different order so that it would be the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection. Clearly, he wanted to emphasize the government nature of it. He thought that would throw it into disrepute rather than the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau emphasizing protecting of consumers. So people fight hard over these things about what the name is, and it really colors the mission. And by the way, he tried to impose that change, even though it became clear that it was going to cost the financial industry something like $300 million to make all those changes on all of their forms and so forth. And eventually his successor, Kathy Kraninger, reversed that directive, really idiotic directive that had been put in place by her predecessor.
Yeah. On that note, I mean, I know that right now the focus has still been on cabinet level, right? I mean, the biggest one that's still outstanding is who's going to be Biden's Attorney General. I think today they introduced Pete Buttigieg as the Secretary of Transportation, and O'Hare Airport is talking about the romance of O'Hare because apparently he proposed to his partner at O'Hare, which I thought was a funny little sideline. But do you have any sense of some of the folks that might be in the mix for CFPB? Would you be interested in going back to run CFPB, or what are your plans in the future? I know you obviously ran for governor of Ohio and lost after a very successful career in the state. Maybe spend a second on that, and then we'll get to the last question.
Well, sure. Look, I'd be very interested in helping the Biden administration. I mean, there's so much damage been done to this country over the past several years that anybody who's at all patriotic, and I'm deeply patriotic and really believe in this country, would like to do their part to help put it back together again, whether that's CFPB or anything else. But I don't want to comment on any of that. I've had discussions with the transition team several times, and they're working on strategies for how to move forward. And I think everybody wants to respect that process. But what I can say is it's quite clear to me from knowing him when he was the vice president and what a big supporter of the CFPB Joe Biden was then and will be now again. I think that for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the CFPB will be a great victory to move that forward once again. I think it's good for the country. As we talked earlier, it does a lot for working and middle class people across this country who aren't often all that well served by the government in Washington. And I think that that can be a critical thing. But in any event, we will see about all that, one step at a time for poor Joe Biden, who's had so much to do, even as they've been challenging his election result. Although now it does seem that that's finally once and for all in the rearview mirror. Thank goodness.
It's kind of surreal. Apparently, most of them, except for Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, who feel like they can't admit that Joe Biden's the president-elect. It is kind of amazing. It does take us really full circle, Richard, because I think you're right. I think it is something that's important to the progressive wing of the party, but I think it also is something we talked about right at the beginning of this conversation, that this sort of maybe disconnect sometimes with particularly, you can call, say, white working class voters, or I would say working class voters in general, irrespective of their ethnicity. This disconnect, this notion that government, it doesn't help them, isn't there on their side. That it always, when it picks a side, it picks the side of the big institutions against the little guy, and it can be helpful.
And who are the lobbyists in Washington? They're people who are highly paid. They devote every day, all day, to strategizing how to advance the interests of their clients. If you're a working class person in the United States, one thing you know is there's nobody there that is being paid to represent you. And you feel like you're kind of left out. You feel alienated from the system. To know that there's parts of the government that actually are trying to find ways to do things for you. By the way, when we would recover money for consumers, and over my 6 years there, we put $12 billion back in the pockets of 30 million Americans, we would often get this confused reaction from the consumers who would get a check in the mail or otherwise find money in their account. And they would want to know, is it a scam? They'd never heard of the CFPB, and they just couldn't really quite believe that there was somebody who had spent the time and made the effort to work on their behalf to recover money for them that they thought was long gone. And that was always a great conversation for us to be able to reassure them that this was a check that they can and should cash. And that was always a good day.
It was an actual money behind it. Yeah. Last question here. There's a question about data brokers. We didn't get to it because there's so many other topics that we could have talked about, gone into detail. It's profound in the book, having battled the sort of credit reporting agencies a little bit, which I think is very linked to some of the other data brokers. This notion, I remember on the privacy stuff I talked about earlier with then State Senator Jackie Speier, now Congresswoman, they were one of the most vociferous opponents, and they were very nefarious about their opposition. That industry has changed quite a bit. I mean, I think most people, and I'm not saying that they did it voluntarily. There was a lot of prodding, and CFPB played an important role in that, as you talk about
We did.
in Watchdog. But the industry has, I think, begun to realize that people can access their scores, their credit scores now in a way that wasn't the case. There was that one website where you could get it free that no one really knew about, and it was all kind of hidden, right? What if you could talk a little bit about data brokers, especially as you think about on a going forward basis, right? You have this sort of convergence that I find fascinating between, what is Facebook? What are some of these other big tech companies? Really, they're data companies. They're companies that the value that they have and create and the money that they make is really driven by monetizing your information. It's why we've worked on privacy issues for a number of years as an organization. I've worked on it in my career personally. And so I wonder if you could kind of talk about that, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, these are very interesting industries, and you see regulators kind of groping their way forward to try to understand what they are. But the nature of them is that they have a business-to-business model that is premised on the value of individual consumer information. So it's our information, but they're not dealing directly with us. They are aggregating our information, they're buying it from some, they're selling it to others, they're putting it together in different ways. It has value, no doubt. That's the backbone of their business model, but the consumer is somehow left out of it. There have been periodic attempts by Congress to legislate in this area to give consumers more rights, but we thought that one of the key things that needed to happen was consumers needed to be more directly exposed to what was going on. Many people just aren't even aware that these big credit reporting companies have credit files on them, and the information that's in those files may or may not be exactly right. And if they get it wrong, it has a tremendous influence on your life, whether you can access credit, what you pay for the credit. It's not an off-the-shelf price. It can vary. And so for us, we felt that getting these companies to be more responsive to consumers, making sure that they actually dealt with consumer disputes about the information and fixed problems, making sure that they understood that accuracy really meant they needed to get it to 1,000% and not 90%, because that's 10% of Americans. That's 30 million Americans potentially who have problems in the credit markets because of the data that's kept on them. So it was really important for us, for consumers to understand more about that and get more exposure to it, and for the companies to be brought under more effective regulation, which was something that was difficult for them at first, and we worked hard at it. But I do agree with you, far from perfect, but there have been a lot of changes made, and there's been a lot of progress made, and there's more to go.
And I think it's a testament to you and the organization that many of those changes CFPB played an important role in. The book is Watchdog. Folks, we're going to keep the chat up for a few more minutes if people want to go over to those links, become a member if you wish. Richard, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us this afternoon, evening for you. Really greatly appreciate your efforts and your career and your work and talking about the book with us.
Well, and I'm glad to spend the time with you and your organization, because you make such a difference every day for the people that you advocate for, fiercely, ferociously, unstintingly. And I saw in Washington how much difference that can make all over the country, as you make in California. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are kind words. And thank you all the people who logged in. We've recorded this session, and so we will then be putting it on the Consumer Federation of California website. We'll also be pushing it out via our social media accounts as well. So on that note, I want to say thanks to everybody at CFC who helped put this together. I want to thank Richard Cordray very much for the book and for speaking with us. And with that, we'll say good afternoon and good evening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.